Okay, so welcome everybody to this, which was meant to be the sixth session of the Spring 2026 workshops in the history of material text, but of course it's actually only the fifth and only the fourth to be conducted in person so far this term, because it has been quite a semester climatologically. It's now, however, the beginning of March and not even 3 weeks from the start of spring. So we've surely moved past our series of university closing snowstorms, we hope. We're thankful in any event for all of you who've stayed with us to this point, and to Hester Blum, whose presentation fell victim to last week's weather, and whose talk will be rescheduled next year. I'd like to promise that we now have regained our momentum, but I remind you that next week is Penn's spring break, and that we will once again be on hiatus. This one planned, however. We'll reconvene 2 weeks from now on March 16th for a presentation from Tina Lupton on Ronald Fraser and the New Left Review, and 3 weeks from today for the first of Joan Judge's Rosenbach lectures, Common Knowers, Readers, Books, and the Making of Vernacular Knowledge in China. From that point on and through the end of April, we trust that nothing will intervene with the regular Monday meetings that have been taking place with extraordinary regularity on Monday afternoons during the academic year, ever since the founding of this workshop by Peter Stallygrass in 1993. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jerry Singerman, formerly a humanities editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press and one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with Zachary Lesser, the Edward W. King Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollock, Curator of Research Services in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, also at Penn. We'd be far less organized were it not for Priya Nambrath, the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts, who I think has just now started circulating a sign-up sheet, around the table. We ask those of you who are in the room to please write your name and encourage you to add your email address as well if you're not already on our listserv and would like to be. Then Priya will be able to send you our regular weekly announcements. For those of you who are joining remotely, we ask that you please mute yourselves, of course, if you haven't done so already, and that you contact Priya in the chat should you have any problem with the audio or video feeds. And if you two are not yet on our listserv and would like to be, please also let Priya know via the chat so that she can sign you up. Once we move into the discussion period, please make yourselves known, whether by posing a comment in the chat, or even better, by turning on your cameras and using the raise hand function on your computers, so that we may see, hear, and call upon you directly. It's my really great pleasure now to introduce Simon Teuscher this evening. Simon studied history, philosophy, and Nordic languages and literatures at the universities of Bergen and Zurich, and has been professor for medieval history in the latter universities since 2007. He's held visiting appointments at the University of Lucerne, Neuchâtel, Basel, and twice at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and from 2000 to 2006 was assistant professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also been a member in residence at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin and the Zentrum für interdisziplinäre Forschung at the University of Bielefeld, where he co-directed the research group on kinship and politics. His monograph, Erzähltes Recht, lokale Herrschaft, Verschriftlichung and Traditionsbildung im Spätmittelalter, appeared in English translation with the University of Pennsylvania Press as Lord's Rights and Peasant Stories, writing the formation of tradition in the later Middle Ages. And I will say that, as embarrassing as it is that I didn't remember the name of the book, Simon didn't either.
in my bio.
So
that's why I didn't.
So I can pass on this. So, among other books of relevance to this evening's presentation, he's co-editor with David Sabian and John Matthew of European Kinship, New Approaches to Long-Term Development, 1300 to 1900, with Bernhard Jussen and others, of Blood and Kinship, Matter for Metaphor from Ancient Rome to the Present, and with Edmund Alder, Tatiana Thelen, and David Sabian of The Politics of Making Kinship. So you can glean a certain theme here. His work has long focused on the intersections of social, cultural, and legal history, and of oral tradition, or perhaps better, of putatively oral tradition, and the material forms that it takes when translated into written text. He's currently completing a monograph on the methods of tracing and measuring kinship relations in the Middle Ages, a project from which this evening's talk is drawn. So please join me now in offering a warm welcome to Simon Teuscher, who will be speaking on, let's say, the paradox of kinship diagrams and the quest to dematerialize relatedness.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for this very generous introduction. Can everybody hear me? So I would like to present a few observations on the long history of the tools, techniques, and materials used to describe and systematize relations of kinship and descent during the European Middle Ages. I'm particularly interested in diagrams and in how scholars, lordly officers, and ultimately ever broader circles of the population used these techniques to conceptualize relatedness. So far, historians of philosophy, of ideas, or of science have rarely considered kinship a topic worthy of. Sorry? Oh, I see. Sorry. So far, historians of philosophy, of ideas, or of science have rarely considered kinship a topic worthy of their interest, although most historians are more than ready to presume that kinship was important in medieval societies. They are not interested in its role as a subject of reflection, research, and reinterpretation. The silent assumption seems rather to be that kinship was an unquestioned given of nature, one that European societies emancipated from as they progressed towards modernity and individualism. I would like to challenge this idea and show to what extent kinship, as we still tend to understand it today, was made, how it resulted from explicit and sometimes heated debates, and how this paved the way for decisively modern phenomena. This is particularly true for consanguinity that we associate with biology and genetics, but that has been strongly influenced by debates about church law during the 11th century and later. And to audiences of those periods, it was everything but natural. On the contrary, it was unintuitive and unheard of in terms of its abstraction and extent. It blanketed out what people experienced as the very essence of being related, knowing each other, socializing, mutuality, or sympathy. And it was novel in the way it detached kinship from the material world, from property and possessions. In what follows, I will first present older medieval patterns of thinking kinship and genealogy in relation to things. Second, I will focus on debates of the 11th century in canon law, that is, in the law of the Catholic Church, that brought about a new understanding of kinship as defined exclusively by facts of marriage and procreation. Third, I shall address the paradoxical consequences of this attempt at dematerializing kinship. During the later Middle Ages, it brought about a whole new material culture of genealogical diagrams and artifacts. At first, these were mainly meant to inform ecclesiastic courts, yet by the late Middle Ages, secular law, administration, and noble representation began to rely on the systematizations of kinship and descent developed in church law. They became a tool for the construction and implementation of new forms of inequality and hierarchy that are typical of the early modern period. To begin with the older kinds of genealogies, we do not have an awful lot of them from before 1350, neither in the form of texts nor in the form of diagrammatic representations. With a few exceptions, the ones we have follow one uniform pattern. They are organized around straight lines that symbolize how a thing, in the largest sense of the word, a kingdom, a castle, or an office, were passed on from one generation to the next, often from fathers to sons. Such lines of succession were also characteristic of the biblical genealogies, both the ones in the Old Testament and the genealogies of the Christ in the Evangelies of Matthew and Luke. You are probably familiar with illustrations of the rods of Jesse that show the succession of kings between Jesse, the father of King David, and the Holy Virgin. Regardless of how winding this line is drawn, it is just one line. And I discovered today at the Art Museum, Philadelphia Art Museum, another Virga Jesse, a rod of Jesse, where the line is cut into 3 sections that are put up parallel, but it's linear nevertheless. It's just a line. In a few strategic positions, such genealogies could include more than one son. Take this genealogy of the kings of France, starting with Charlemagne on top, going down to huge Capet in the square at the very bottom. This line of successions, fathers and sons, is represented in the left column. The diagram departs from linearity in a few places. There is the additional right column to show that the Capet family too are very much related to the Carolingians in several ways. So the siblings and spouses and mothers that are needed to show this are included in the picture, but not a single one more than needed. Such genealogies are also the basis of Georges Duby's hypothesis of a transformation linéaire from the 12th century onwards, a new understanding of kinship that he thought was oriented along patrilines. Anita Guerreau has made the convincing argument that the lines Duby observed are not, as he believed, patrilines, the way social anthropologists would define them, namely conceptions of kinship that include all male members and their offspring, including daughters, but without these daughters' children. Rather than such patrilines, Guerreau argues, these were topolines, lines of succession in the ownership of places, castles, counties, and seigniories. They show how these were passed on, often from fathers to sons, but when there were no sons, also to daughters and their husbands, or even to unrelated followers. Guerreau even questions that this is kinship in the pure sense at all. It is, she says, more about trajectories along which things were transmitted from one generation to the next. Now, I'm not sure that there ever had been such a thing as kinship in the pure sense, but Anita Guerreau has an important point. Medieval representations, both textual and diagrammatic, of kinship are usually organized around a thing that could be more material, such as seigniories and castles, or a little less, such as offices and crowns. We could even say that kinship in these representations is not simply about relationships between people, but centrally between people and things, and about how things mediate relationships between people. The most elaborate and sophisticated system of describing kinship that was available in medieval Europe was the one developed in Roman inheritance law. It was, at its origins, also about relationships between people and material things. In Roman law, kinship was systematically quantified, divided into degrees, by the way, long before the concept of quantification in degrees was applied to temperature or to density. The system went back to the 3rd century, and the eminent jurist Paulus Prudentissimus, he wrote a comprehensive treatise to assign a degree to every conceivable relationship based on descent, tracing common ancestresses and ancestors as far back as 10 generations. In this way, Paulus sought to regulate once for all a fairly special case in Roman inheritance law. If a deceased paterfamilias left no heirs belonging to his household or to his agnatio, his paternal line, then a systematization like this was needed to determine who from the wider group of cognates was the next of kin. And these understandings of kinship were challenged during the debates about the Catholic incest prohibitions in the 11th century. And that's the second topic I would like to address. During the early Middle Ages, the Roman law system of quantification began to be reapplied to new purposes. For example, to scale verguilt for killing kin. Ecclesiastical courts also relied on it to decide whether relationships fell under the Catholic incest prohibitions, that is, prohibitions of sex and marriage between kin. This is not the place to expound on the Catholic theology of incest. Suffice to say that according to a tradition going back to St. Augustine, the prohibitions responded less to a taboo of an abhorrent thing, certainly as far as the more remote kin are concerned. Instead, the incest prohibitions were meant to help spread love, which makes them perhaps even more exotic. St. Augustine criticized that it was a waste of love when two siblings or two cousins married, because they had to love each other anyway. The only God-pleasing use of libido was to form bonds of love beyond those that already existed. The limits of the marriage prohibitions, and hence of kinship in the sense of canon law, were reached at a certain distance, the 7th degree, according to many authoritative writings. This turned the measurement of the closeness of kinship into a vital skill. Priests had to master this. Most lay people knew that it existed. Usually Roman inheritance law or some variation of it were used to measure. Yet in the 11th century, church reformers took offense of the use of the Roman law methods in matters of incest. And this for two reasons. First, because they thought it did not prohibit.
I'm back.
And second, because they found its foundation in the transmission of material property inappropriate for the purpose of church law. The ensuing debate was remarkably feisty and spiteful to be about counting methods. Here's some quotes of mutual accusations that the teachings of the others were like a leper on the body of the church, or that the others were ignorant professors clinging to their pestilential chairs and teach lessons worse than stinking belches. An important background was the so-called rediscovery of Roman law. One of its centers was Ravenna, where the controversy began. Local lawyers who engaged in close readings of the old Roman legal texts became aware that some ecclesiastic courts used the method of attributing degrees of kinship that was no longer in accordance with the letter of the Roman law. Codex Justiniani stipulated that one had to calculate the degree of kinship between person A and person B by counting. Do I have a pointer? No, well, for this slide it works well. Okay, you had to calculate the degree of kinship between person A and person B by counting the number of ancestors between A and their nearest common ancestor. And to this, they added the number of descendants from this common ancestor down to B. So even the son of a nephew was thus in the second plus third, that is fifth degree, and the limit of prohibitions at the seventh degree was quickly reached, this way of counting up and down again. Too quickly, as adherents of the church reform protested. Instead of counting individual ancestors, they contended, one ought to count the generations between A and B on the one side and the common ancestor on the other. Calculated in this way, even fourth degree relatives were had the common great-great-grandparent. So these were very distant people that you would not usually know. Pope Alexander finally tried to end the dispute by declaring the latter method, the canon law method, as binding in matters pertaining to the church's marriage prohibitions. Alexander relied on a sophisticated justification of his advisor, Peter Damian, an ascetic and theologian, and I would like to look a little closer at this justification. Peter openly questioned the authority of Roman law. He began his argument by what he felt was a distasteful scenario. If the prohibition extended only to 7 degrees according to Roman law, one could not exclude that two brothers lived long enough to be able to marry their great-grandchildren to each other. Still worse, if their father was lucky enough to still be alive, he could conclude a marriage between two of his own offspring. This, Peter concluded, amounted to a form of joining one's own children in marriage. One of Damian's main objections on the more principled side to the counting method of Roman law was that it rested on a logic of property transmission, which he found inappropriate for ecclesiastic purposes. In Roman law, he explains, one counts from one person to the next because property can only be passed on from a legator to a beneficiary. In contrast, the method he advocates considers that it takes two to marry. Hence, the need to measure the distance between the two partners taken together and their closest common ancestor. Moreover, Peter Damian explained that the spirit of the church prohibition asked for a radical extension of the limits of kinship beyond the people that even in the most extreme of cases could inherit from each other, beyond the relationships that there were specific terms for, and even beyond the entire circle of those we know or suspect to be related to us by the remotest bond of kinship. He discussed how to implement a rule issued by an older council of the church that forbade marriage as far as there was common memory of ancestors. No, as far as there was memory of common ancestors, not common memory, as far as anybody could remember. It can seem paradoxical that Peter suggests using the very system of measuring kinship in Roman inheritance law that he rejects in matters of marriage as a generalized expression of how far kin can be memorized. If it is possible to inherit down to the 10th degree of the Roman method, he argues, then prohibitions need to go even beyond this. This also meant that he wanted the prohibitions to extend beyond the very specialized kin terminology that Roman law specialists learned during their studies and that covered all those 10 degrees. His opponents accused him of weaving so far-stretched genealogies that they could no longer be described in words, and hence no longer made any sense whatsoever. Now, Peter's answer to this was, well, we have to rely on numbers because words can't cover it anymore. But with numbers, we can go ever further. The kinship system Peter Damian advocated related humans to humans through nothing than marriage and descent, regardless of their status, their property, and their recognition of the kin ties. Remember that in Roman law, paternity also depends on recognition. That was not an issue Peter Damian wanted to somehow enter into the incest question. The kinship of Roman law had been a system, in contrast, of relating humans as far as they were free Roman citizens and the property they inherited from one another. According to a strict reading, cognatio, as it was understood in Roman inheritance law, did not apply to slaves. They neither owned nor inherited, but were themselves owned and inherited. This is explicitly expressed in the classic treatise on the degrees of kinship by Paulus, and it's also in the Institutiones of Justinian. In both cases, the wording suggests that the authors did not think that slave actually had no kinship. They reckoned with the existence of slave kinship. They used the word serviles cognationes. But a careful reading of the relevant Roman law texts and the way they tied the graduation to property transmission as a privilege of free citizens was more likely to disconcert than reassure the practice of using graduation to define kinship regardless of status. The question could have been unsettling with regard to modern slavery. Even many in the 11th century's elite were neither free nor were they proprietors of their possessions in the sense of Roman law. They were subject to one or the other status of servility, and they held fiefs rather than property, fiefs that were not automatically passed on to offspring, but returned to a lord after death. While a degree in an authoritative definition of Roman law was a measure of possible transmissions of the property of citizens, Peter Damian advocated an understanding of degrees as measures of brotherhood. He mobilized St. Augustine's interpretation of kinship as an extension of fraternity, stating that the first degree needed to be a first degree of fraternity, with cousins being brothers in the second degree and second cousins being brothers in the third degree. Historians of law refer to this extensive new quantification system as the canonical or sometimes the Germanic one. Some have hypothesized that it was based on a Germanic understanding of kinship as shared blood. However, there is no trace of a specifically Germanic understanding of kinship in the sources. And even in the epic debates among 11th century scholars, there is practically no mention of blood. This even though during the early Middle Ages, the term consanguinitas, with the component sanguis, blood, had come to replace the Roman word cognatio as the generic term for kinship by descent. The word was there, but it did not lead to an interest in blood as a bodily substance that constitutes kinship, and even less that transmits likeness or traits or what we associate with genetics. We should therefore consider reversing the chronology. The canonical counting system was not inspired by pre-existing ideas about shared and mixed blood. Rather, it took centuries after the development of the new counting system before professors to illustrate this difficult subject matter didactically, and they all underline that it is difficult. It's one of the most difficult things in law studies. Before professors began to associate the counting with portions of mixed and shared blood. Empirically, this hypothesis is more plausible than that of a pre-existence of blood concepts that left no traces in the sources. But it's also conceptually more interesting because it forces us to give a history to the familiar metaphor of shared and mixed blood, instead of treating it as the simplified biology of people who did not yet know better. The new counting method was very abstract. It operated with a kinship system of unheard of extension, and it had no anchor in the persistence of a thing that perdured across generation, such as property or an office. Before blood was used to make this more concrete, scholars coped by using diagrams, and that's my third topic today. Probably diagrammatic representations of the Roman law system already circulated in the Roman Empire, but so far none have been found. The oldest extant diagrams of consanguinity are contained in manuscripts of Isidore's Encyclopedia, who is also the first to describe this Roman law counting system without explicitly relating it to inheritance, leaving open the possibility to use it for other things, such as to decide whether a relationship was incestuous. And I have to maybe say at this point that the Romans, of course, also had incest rules, but they did not use graduation to describe them. They operated with classes of kinship, such as agnatio and cognatio. They had this system of numerals that they did not use in the context of incest. Probably from the 12th century onwards, diagrams of kinship spread rapidly in manuscripts of church law. We have them here all on the table. Along with the similar diagrams of affinity, of kinship through marriage, diagrams of consanguinity became a mandatory element in authoritative collections of church law, such as Gratian's Decretum and the Decretals, both of which are here on the table in manuscripts. The diagrams could be very sober and technical, like this one. Their main purpose was to facilitate determining the exact kind of kin relationship between two people. And what you did is that you started in the middle, and you would go up to the father, the grandfather, the grandmother, if necessary, and then from here down to lateral kin, to the brother or the sister of the grandmother, and down to person B. So you would make this movement with your finger, digitum. So this is digital in the earliest sense, the word. Quite many of these diagrams were painted as lush miniatures. The diagram could be shown along with an authoritative person, a king, or even this one is probably God himself. It could be given the appearance of a cross, of buildings, or of a fountain where the different degrees of consanguinity spilled into each other. It could be projected on the hand or on the entire human body, so that each joint would represent a degree, and ego, where you start, would be with your genitals. Quite And although the diagrams of consanguinity and affinity, like many other diagrams in the Middle Ages, were called arbores, trees, certainly from the 12th century onwards, they were hardly ever drawn as actual trees before the 15th century, as Christian Klappisch has demonstrated. One reason was that they represented the sequence of generations from top to bottom. Hence, to the extent they could be imagined as resembling trees, they looked like trees that stood on their heads, and some illustrations do indeed show roots at the very top rather than at the bottom of the arbor, because this is the way it grows, top down. And that it is top down has to do with the whole Latin terminology that puts ancestors above and descendants, ascendants, descendants. So this was in the terminology. Only in the 15th century and in connection with new uses emerged illustrations that made the diagrams look like actual trees. To begin with, scholars of canon law, and canon law was very much a scholarly affair, were unsure how to treat these diagrams. Many manuscripts of law were decorated with illuminations, but the section on kinship was the only one in the vast body of church law where the rules themselves were expressed in a visualization. Was such a diagram then part of the law? Was it authoritative, authentic, and valid like written canons? Some scholars argued for its validity by claiming that Charlemagne had invented the diagram. More fundamentally, authors of the 13th and 14th centuries discussed whether the law could include visual material besides words you could read or hear. Some answered by giving long lists of things where lawyers already were relying on what they saw to measure the seas of land plots, to detect forgery on a charter, to determine whether a man was potent, a woman pregnant, or a boy grown up. But within few decades, the kinship diagrams themselves had become both authoritative and objects of erudite commentaries. Professors of law and theology analyzed and explained them much like textual paragraphs of the law. Some of these glossa would comment on the individual elements of the visualization, the line, bifurcation, cells. Others tested the limits of the diagrammatic idiom by construing wildly incestuous genealogies that allowed to reduce the number of an ego's grandparents to 3 or just 2. Or this is the other side of the same coin, to establish as many as possible different kinship ties between the same 2 people, with fathers who were also the grandfathers of their sons, and mothers who were also the half-sisters of their daughters, all of which was translated into little diagrams like this one. This is one of these very incestuous diagrams. And that it's very incestuous, although it's in the context of incest prohibitions, didn't disturb the scholars. They were fascinated by the theoretical possibilities of how far can you go. And these discussions can appear as pedantry and vain erudition that Jacques Le Goff considered typical of late scholastics. Yet this is to miss the point. Playing with the formal possibilities of representing kin relations was related to new uses of the diagrammatic idiom outside the field of both inheritance and marriage prohibitions. Towards the end of the 15th century, the diagram of consanguinity began to be used as a model for the representation of the ancestry of noblemen. Only now were the first family trees drawn along the pattern that became so widespread during the early modern period and beyond. Even diagrams of consanguinity were now sometimes drawn according to this pattern, with the oldest ancestors below, close to the roots, and the youngest ones still in their cradles in the uppermost branches of the tree. One of the oldest extant examples of an actual family tree representing a secular family on the continent, namely the Habsburgs up to Emperor Maximilian, is a several meter long painting that they probably could hang up in assembly halls in their castles. It is, to be precise, more of a bush than a tree. When a man and a woman share a butt, they can get children. Butts with several women represent successive wives. The resulting pedigree is no longer organized around a succession to a crown or a title. It shows bifurcations in almost every generation from which new lines result. So you have a multiplicity of lines. It contains, as a matter of fact, all children of Habsburg men, even the ones who died as babies, as the meticulous investigations of art historians have demonstrated. In this respect, the representation follows the church law conception of consanguinity: only relationships of procreation and all of them. It combines this with a male bias, however, that is as systematic as the orientation on procreation. It actually represents procreation as a largely male affair. Stalks that lead to sons spring out of the heart of their fathers, not of the mothers and not of the butt their share, but from the fathers. And the stalks that lead to daughters, this is the daughter, the long-haired is her guy, they are already cut off from the bush, but the father still holds them in their hand. And whereas the stalks always continue with sons, they stop with daughters. It's not that they were childless, but it stops systematically with all the daughters. So this is actually patrilinearity in the purest of sense, as also Anita Guerra would have to concede. Another new diagrammatic pattern of representing kinship and ancestry in the nobility followed the canon law model even more closely and without flipping the traditional diagram on its head. The so-called proofs of ancestry. These were actually representations of a test and of a procedure. Ever more collegiate chapters and tournament societies in the Holy Empire and also on the Iberian Peninsula admitted new members only after they had proved their noble ancestry. It is possible that such proofs existed already earlier, but were mainly concerned with the candidate's father and paternal grandfather. But from the 15th century onward, they began to follow a rigidly bilateral pattern and investigated the noble status of 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and in some cases, like in this extreme case that is also quite late, even further. In terms of the diagrammatic representation, this is an enlarged diagram of consanguinity with its bottom showing the descendants. Here, the descendants would start in the regular diagram of consanguinity cut off. Such proofs of ancestry occur in family chronicles, but also decorate gravestones, churches, and public squares. The underlying logic of determining kinship and belonging was consequential. I can only hint to this very briefly and as a conclusion. Kinship did not disappear in modernity. Most of its forms continued to use material things to mediate relationships. But the dematerialized conception developed in canon law became particularly productive in attempts at dividing large groups and establishing some of the most consequential and brutal hierarchies and forms of inclusion and exclusion of Western modernity. After the mass conversions and expulsions of Jews and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula, the same investigations of bilateral ancestors were used to determine whether candidates to specific offices or to universities had the required pure Christian blood, that is, no Jewish or Muslim ancestors. Already early in the 16th century, the tests were also applied in the Iberian colonies, in the Americas, and in India, also to determine whether individuals were of pure Spanish or Portuguese origin, or whether they had ancestors from indigenous, for example, Native American or African background. Whereas ideas of purity and pollution had motivated the tests of nobility and of pure Christian blood, these new colonial tests of groups of origins or castas use the possibilities inherent in quantification of kinship to quantify portions about mixed bloods, half-bloods, mestizos, quarterons, octerons. This entire terminology of racial classification emerged there, and this several centuries before skin color and body traits became decisive markers of race. And even once skin color had become the central issue after 1800, the canon law understanding of ancestry and its imagery of sharing and mixing blood portions remained central to the legal implementation of inequality. Just think of concepts like blood quantum or one drop rule in US legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for an extraordinarily rich talk. Floor is open for comments. Liliana.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I actually have two questions, and I will be brief. The first one is when you showed the tree where the women are cut off.
Yes.
The men have further branches. So I wonder whether abstraction is ever fully abstraction, because the patrilineal is also how the inheritance of objects works. So I want you to comment on this, because it seems to me that you drew a difference that is understandable, but may only work in degrees, and you don't get rid of the material. The other question that I have is a very, very small one. The aristocracy was all related. Were there discussions beforehand in terms of marriage that brought out these trees? And were there fights about this? Because there again, you have the inheritance of an empire or of a realm together with these laws.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, to start with the second question, yes, there was a lot of consideration of the diagrams when discussing marriage projects. There are also extant some sources that show how they drew up different candidates and looked at the distance. And once you you got accused of incest, people would bring diagrams and sketches of all kinds. There's a dissertation by I don't remember the first name. Hauk is her last name. Who looks at the Florentine sketches of this kind and the entire procedure of testing. Testing candidates and also proving that there was no kinship once an accusation had happened. So this is an important business in the nobility, and it may also lead over to your second question. Yes, there is a patrilinear bias in inheritance at almost all times. Nevertheless, it is also the case that a total exclusion of women and daughters is very exceptional. So you have a wide array of different systems in different periods. And you also see in the diagrams that it's not like Dewey thought, and not later than Dewey thought, a total shift to patrilinearity, although it may seem so in this Habsburg family tree. But at the same time, they're doing these very bilateral proofs of nobility, where again the bilateral kin idea is very alive, but then at the same time, everybody is represented with his coat of arms that is passed on patrilinearly. So it's complicated conglomerates of the different conceptions that are used according to situations, according to the question at stake. I don't know whether this answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, the patrilineal is also, I mean, way back, think about the tree of Jesse, right? It's not tracing to a paternal ancestor of Christ, but to Mary, right? It's not, the tree of Jesse is not tracing the lineage back to God the Father. It's tracing it back to a mother.
Yeah, or ending with a mother.
Yeah.
I mean, it culminating, one has to say, in a woman.
So are there other
And
there
in a
secular genealogies?
non-genealogical
Yeah.
relationship, because certainly on the father's side.
Yeah.
So it's a recomposed family.
Yeah. We always thought it was a strange family, but yeah. Ada.
Thank you for such a wide-ranging presentation. It was really wonderful. And so I have kind of also two questions because, tradition. And so for one, just on this question of like using these things in practice, at least for the 12th and 13th century, I'm more familiar with like the concept in the breach. So like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who marries her second cousin and gets a divorce because of consanguinity, and then marries her second cousin, like in England, right? So, but like, it's more, at least for the 12th or 13th century, I don't know, I don't know, but I keep seeing these, the trees in customary law manuals, the secular ones. So they're there. But when I read about its existence in a practical life, it seems like the thing has already happened, so I don't know if that's just an impression or just France, and then the other thing I was thinking about is maybe a related concept to consanguinity, the word familia, family. And I was wondering how you see that changing over time. The thing I was thinking about was Burkhard of Worms has this book of, text, the Lex Familia of Fortamiensis, about, and it's all of the people that live in the area, right, that he kind of curates. And so how does the concept of family change as these concepts of consanguinity change?
But for the breaches, I mean, there's a whole literature, Charles Donoghue, and people who have, lots of people who have tried to establish how common it was that people did not abide by these laws, and it is probably relatively common in the high elite, but my personal impression is that it's not a hugely widespread practice. I mean, there have also been these hypotheses by Jack Goody and others who really expected that it was the most normal thing to do, and that it was a huge fight on the church side to prevent it from happening. Which I'm not sure about. And then breaches are certainly from the 13th century onwards part of the system, because the Pope gives dispensations, and they want breaches to happen. And I think power-wise, the interesting thing for church institutions, for bishops, and for the Pope is that this is always a possibility to intervene or not intervene in marriage projects, either before they happen or after they have happened. There are all these possibilities. And the interesting thing for me from the perspective of conceptualizing kinship, for that purpose, it doesn't even matter all that much whether it's done or not done. But what is interesting is that the anxiety that people would invent kinship ties to get, as a matter of fact, divorces, invalidity of marriage, was huge in the 13th century. And this led to the development of a very elaborate and sound methodology of testing. Already in the 13th century, lots of canon lawyers reflected on how do we prove that there really is kinship, and how do we deal, it's all about witness statements, but how do we deal with different witnesses? How do we deal with contradictions between the witnesses? So there is a whole apparatus of testing procedures that is established, and then the nobility or the Iberian monarchies who wanted to test pure blood, or wanted the Germans who wanted to test pure nobility, could rely on. They could recur to this, and of course they were tricksing and cheating and bribing and doing everything. But the very idea that you can, if you do it right, really establish it also over many generations, I think is very consequential, regardless of the fact that people cheat their way around it.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, at the village level, right, two people come to the priest they want to marry. Is the genealogical tree worked out for them in the way that one might fill out a horoscope, or is the concern only with upper classes and indeed cases where there are substantial properties to be inherited?
I think it goes beyond the upper classes in the 14th century. I mean, from the 13th century, from Lateran IV, if anybody in the parish raises a suspicion, the priest has to examine it, and he has to refer it to the bishop's law court, and it in theory it has to be properly examined, and witnesses have to be asked. And in Haug's case, this goes relatively far down in Florentine society. It's so no, I wouldn't say. But then again, don't quiz me too hard on this. I know it's interesting to know how much it was implemented, but there are people who know this so much better than me.
Rita.
Thank you for this. Really interesting. I'm just wondering about the vocabulary of distant relations. The reason I ask is I once had to translate a really insanely difficult passage from the 12th century, where there were all kinds of relatives who were kind of distant. My aunt's sister-in-law, or my sister-in-law, or another sister-in-law, and so on. And there was no consistent, the context was that this was meant to be a very difficult vocabulary exercise. That was the point. It was kind of showing off. But the vocabulary was utterly inconsistent and in ways that you really couldn't tell what the relations were. Now, this is for much more distant relations than, brothers and sisters and, let's say, even nieces and nephews. But I just wonder to what extent the vocabulary is very consistent or it becomes kind of loose at a certain point. And I mean, whatever, sense you have of this would be really interesting.
For consanguinity, Roman law provides a very consistent, distinct vocabulary for all the 7 degrees.
For all the 7. Okay.
But that's consanguinity, that's
Yes.
of descent, and also a relatively elaborate terminology for affinity, a little less. So that is available, and that is what Peter Damian refers to. And he says we need to go beyond this, although it is clear also for him that this is very specialized knowledge.
Yeah.
No one in everyday Romance languages would be able to use such distinctive language. It's a technical language that pertains to Roman law. But what scholars tried to do when they spread these diagrams in the 14th and 15th century, that is to translate. And they give you versions, German, French, Italian versions. And my impression is that they invent it as they go, because there is nothing.
Yes.
We don't find that in other texts. It's an attempt to translate a very technical Latin terminology into the vernaculars. And I think an important point of a lot of the kinship terminology that we find in literary texts or also in legal texts that deal with other things than incest is exactly to blur specifications. You call your brother-in-law a brother and
Yes.
your mother-in-law a mother, and it's about building closeness and not proving distance.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Ivan and then John.
Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I have a question about something very concrete. Do we have examples of family trees that are based directly on the tree of Jesse? And if yes, when do they start to appear?
Well, it depends on what you think is enough resemblance to be based on.
Linear structure, right? Linear.
With the linear structure, I would add the one I have shown about Charlemagne, but there's of course no one lying on the ground and sleeping as Jesse does, and there's nothing sprouting out of his womb. So it's hard to decide, but we do find quite a lot of successions of kings that are following this model, and we also find juxtapositions where you have Jesse and leading up to the Holy Virgin, and you have a secular model besides it or on the opposite wall of the church. And
when do they start to appear?
In the 12th, 13th century, and probably the 14th century is the period where you have most trees of Jesse, at least extant ones. I mean, there's always the question of what.
No, but I'm asking about these family trees that are brought.
Yes.
So they start to appear already in the 12th century.
I would say yes. I would say, but don't nail me on it. We would really need to look at examples. John?
Thank you. This is fascinating, and I'm totally out of my depth here. But one of the interesting topics that you covered is about this legal status of the diagram, and I wondered if we could go back to this for a minute. The notion that, you know, we're looking at some decretals on the table, thanks to Nick. As you put it, like, could the law include these visual diagrams? And I mean, I guess to turn this into a question, like, is there an attempt to regularize the diagram and or the commentary on the diagram? And I never really thought about it, you know, in these books that, you know, there could be there's a pretty obsessive copying and commentary tradition. You have to get it right. Is there a similar attempt to be prescriptive about the copying of the diagram? It sounds like there would have to be. And is there therefore like a textual tradition of explaining how the diagram is to be done and by whom? That makes sense?
Yes, and it's examined, and I'm struggling with finding the name. There is this German who wrote this huge Publikationsschrift.
Someone spent their life figuring this out. Okay.
The name will come back to me. It's really embarrassing. Who examined these questions. He wrote a big monograph on the diagrams as an art historian, the diagrams of consanguinity and affinity. And he says that there is a long period where the transmission of the text and the transmission of the diagrams are unrelated. And from a certain point, I think it's in the 14th century, they begin to be related. So you will have the same shape with Grecian manuscripts, with Isidore manuscripts. So they get canonized and become part of the textual tradition. Whereas earlier on, you could take the diagram from another model than the text. So they do grow together, and they are terribly obsessed about how you draw it. So part of these glossae on the diagrams are always how you draw it and where you start. And then you do this, and then you draw this line, and you make this circle, and you write this number into it. And it's very tedious, really.
I'm sure, yeah.
It's like an IKEA.
Have to be right about this because it's
so you have to be very careful about it. And they also boast of innovations. They say, look at this, I managed to draw this as a building, and I could, something that really fascinates them, especially in the 14th and 15th century, when they have gotten over this inimity towards the Roman law diagram, is to include both counting methods in one diagram, and then to explain how the relationship between the two unfolds. So they're terribly interested in the details of how you draw, but they are also interested in innovation. They want to innovate. They want to do this better. They want to make this easier to understand. They keep repeating it's so hard for our students, and our colleagues are drawing this in a way that makes it even harder. And I have now found this building or the fountain that really explains, brings across the point really well.
Creative impulse versus the strictly pragmatic, has to be this way kind of impulse.
And I think these discussions, I mean, as I said, that's important for the productivity of the diagrammatic language. That's what facilitates to reapply it in entirely different areas. There is a real nerdy creativity.
Yeah.
You have the printed, we have some examples of printed ones which become then more standardized, I feel.
Right.
We have an early 16th century edition. It's too big, so I didn't take it up. But, you know, big printed, and they're often the only printed diagrams in the whole, you know, text.
It's the only thing. Right. It's the only visual thing in canon law. All the rest is decoration. You can have, of course, illuminations that decorate, but this is content, and it's content that is glossated on, that is commented on, that is canonical.
Zach, and then Jim.
Well, thank you. That was really, well, there was a lot. It was, you ended on a very big point.
Oh my.
From I like the movement of it from this very technical question, very large questions of the great modern idea of race. And I was particularly, I may have missed it, so forgive me if I'm asking, because I was trying to follow everything, but I'm interested in the conceptual shift from the Roman idea where you count up and then back down, and the canonical idea where you count sort of horizontal strata. And were you saying that in some way that shift in itself contains within it the germ of this way of thinking in terms of consanguinity and portions of, half or quarter, or, what's the connection between that shift in thinking from Roman to canonical, in the way, just the counting system, and the big issues you were talking about the kind of emergence of ideas of kinship based on blood as carrying qualities and traits and that sort of thing, or am I?
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, you are right. I don't want to turn Peter Damian into the Leibniz of kinship, and I don't want him to be the origin of everything. I think that would be wrong. And there is a lot of potential in what he did that he did not see himself and did not use and was not interested in. But I do think that it makes a huge difference, that the two counting methods make a huge difference in one respect. And that is that with Roman law, and certainly when you apply it to property transmission, it's always about those triangles. So it's also about lines from one person to the other. Inherent in the canon law method and in this idea that these are degrees of brotherhood is a potential of using the diagram to think groups, circles. You have all the people in the second degree, all the people in the third. That's not interesting if you're looking at the closest hair. That's not a question. But for the canon law prohibitions, this limit at the fourth degree or at the seventh degree earlier on, this is a group of people that have certain legal characteristics. Namely, you can't marry them. And once you have this, you can assign other characteristics to this group. They are noble, they have pure blood, they are pure Spanish, they are, you can do all these things. It's not like it's done in a day, but I do think that the counting system allows for something new that is not happening for a long time. That's what I underlined with the blood too. They have the word consanguinity. You have this possibility to think this as a quarter blood from one side and the 3/4 from the other, and they don't do it until the 15th century, but then they do it, and we haven't really gotten out of the habit of doing it yet.
Jim Duffin, and then I know we have some questions or comments from remote.
I have a question that's kind of sort of related, since falls off of Zach's comments of sort of the difference between the canon and the Roman approach. And it relates specifically to adoption, in the sense that I would think in the Roman sense, adoption is all about, I should say, the kinship is about the passing of property. So in a legal sense, if you declare somebody your heir, then that property can pass to them. But the blood relationship between the two people doesn't matter. The law establishes a relationship between them, and therefore that's an important matter. But I was curious to know whether under canon law, somebody adopting somebody, does that put them still within the whole line of looking at connections to them? Or is there a point at some point where they realize, well, they're not a true blood relation to the between the adoptee and the adoptor, then we do not have to consider it. I realize there are cases, probably maybe among nobles and others, where somebody may adopt like a niece or a nephew, but then there probably are cases where they adopt a complete stranger. And I imagine adoption perhaps was more common in the Roman.
It is,
yes.
yes.
In the Christian one.
Yes. We don't have to overstate the differences. There are, in the field of incest law that exists in the Roman period too, there is an awareness of the problem. They have these cases. A father didn't recognize his daughter and then meets her many years later in a brothel. And is he committing incest or is he not? So it's not like they didn't see that problem. But it's unrelated to the question of degrees, and it's unrelated to the quantitative approach. And in the Middle Ages, cognatio is a huge thing, and consanguinity and affinity are just 2 of 4 kinds. There is cognatio legalis that is constituted through adoption, and there is cognatio spiritualis that we also have diagrams for on the table that is based on godparent relationships, and you not only your godparent is forbidden as a sex or marriage partner, but also some of his or her close consanguines are also forbidden. So there is an enormous amount of people who fall under incest prohibitions. And although formal adoption is rare in the Middle Ages, the canon law almost always discusses it, and often even has a diagram of legal kinship. That's a later thing. That's 14th, 15th century. But then they start to say, which is also interesting when it comes to the canonization of the diagrams, that they begin to say, well, if this is a kind of cognatio that is prohibited, it needs to have a diagram too. We need to have 4 diagrams. If we have 4 kinds of cognationes, we have to have 4 kinds of diagrams. Yeah. Priya, you have some comments?
We have a question on Zoom from Emily Steiner.
Can you speak up, Priya, please? Yeah.
The question is from Emily Steiner.
Mm-hmm.
Zoom. She says, "Hi, thank you for the interesting talk. I wonder if you could talk more about the pedagogical value of consanguinity. Consanguinity trees often appear in manuscripts with virtues and vices trees, for example. What are we learning about kinship beyond kinship?"
I'm not sure how far I want to go there. There have been cultural studies people such as Macho in Vienna who contended that the arbor of consanguinity is at the beginning of it all, that it's the Ur-diagram. And that all the other diagrams, the diagrams of Raimund Lull, for example, the famous diagrams of the Aristotelic ontology, and everything else are emancipations from kinship that has been there since very old ages. I don't think so. I think diagrams have been drawn for many reasons, and I would, in a way, be more eager to learn from logic, to know what we can learn, what logic taught kinship, rather than what kinship taught logic. I don't think these are the master diagrams. I think there are lots of interesting and authoritative diagrammatic traditions in the Middle Ages. You probably know Jeffrey Hamburger's book on diagrams. So I'm reluctant to give the Arboris Consanguinitati a Sonderstatus in diagrammatics, but it is possible that it has inspired other diagrammatic traditions beyond genealogy, but I'm not really fully aware of it. And also, if you look at Christian Klappisch's book that is on trees, and it's not on consanguinity, it's on trees in general, on tree diagrams that are either called trees or look like trees. And I suspect that she started from a kind of hypothesis like that. It's all started with Arbor Consanguinitatis, but she ended up with something completely different, where the Arbor Consanguinitatis is just one of many.
It's degenerated in the modern world to the phone tree.
I don't know whether this answers your question, Emily.
Ada, did you have a comment? No? Yes, you did. No?
It flitted out of my mind if I did, sorry.
Rita.
I have is that?
She said thank you.
Good, okay.
Yeah.
So I have a kind of a follow-up. It's more of a comment than a question. The kinds of diagrams that I know best are classifications of the sciences. And I mean, which can also be tree diagrams. Some of them can be very, very complicated. And I never really understood why they are so unstable. And what I understand now from this talk is that the reason that consanguinity diagrams are so stable, it's the law. It's the law that's keeping things. I always thought that it was the diagram that made things stable.
Because it was so great.
Why, classifications of the sciences could be so marvelously, fluid. So, depending on which century you're working in and whether you want to foreground one science or another science, you like ethics better than something else, to go up and down. But it's just that there's no legal, pressure from the outside in terms of classifying the sciences, whereas the law insists on the stability of the content. So it's just an interesting problem that it's not the diagram that's stabilizing things. It's the law, and all that the diagram is doing is reflecting other kinds of pressures, other kinds of conditions. It's really interesting. So you've just illuminated something for me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And if you allow me to expand a little on that, I think it's the same when it comes to conceptualizing kinship at large. There are so many situations where people do that when they pass on property, when they arrange a wedding, when they gather allies in a political struggle. And it's only the law that comes with this rigidity of constellations of genealogy. You don't need that anywhere else. You invite the family members you like to. Oh, I haven't answered the family question. You invite the family members you like to your wedding. You cooperate politically with those with whom you can, and most noble conflicts are with brothers about inheritance, and so they will be on opposite sides of the conflict. But in legal thinking, you can establish this enormous rigidity that we today associate with biology. But they established that long before biology existed, and to a certain extent, biologists could build on the rigidity of the legal structure.
It's really interesting. Wow.
Well, with that, I think huge opening outward. We should allow ourselves further time to ponder, and we should allow you a bit of rest, but we also owe to you a huge amount of thanks. So, thank you.